Good afternoon. Thank you. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and to mark this special occasion. So I've been asked to answer, is the two-state solution still possible? And to talk a bit about anti-Zionism. So the notion of steeds in Dutch is still, right? Oh, steeds means still, right? Still. The notion of still assumes that it was once possible and something happened that maybe now it won't be possible. It's a story that I've heard many times, typically goes like this, especially if it comes, let's say, from people defending the Palestinian side of the argument. They will be like, oh yes, there was once a two-state solution possible, but you, big bad Israel, went and built settlements, and damn it, we really wanted a two-state solution, but now it won't be possible. That's kind of the underlying message. So I want to make the argument, as you can guess from the way that I've presented it, that it was never possible to begin with because, at least from the perspective of one side, it was never in the cards. And I'll start first from the physical side. Is it physically or technically possible? Of course. The problem is that it was never about the physical and technical issues. Some of you know I often share my story as someone who grew up in the Israeli left, fervently believing that the only thing that stood between us and peace is a Palestinian state, Palestinian control of territories of the West Bank and Gaza. I voted for every Israeli prime minister that attempted to put that to the test. I was euphoric in the 90s. I supported Ehud Barak and I supported the disengagement. And as I'm living through that, I see Ehud Barak, an Israeli prime minister, elected on a platform of making peace. And in parentheses, I'll help you with something, because sometimes this story goes, oh, a Jewish extremist assassinated Rabin, and that's why we don't have a two-state solution. It's one of the easiest things to empirically disprove, because only 5 years after Rabin was assassinated, Ehud Barak, an Israeli prime minister, was elected in a landslide on a platform to propose to the Palestinians what Rabin in his darkest nightmares did not imagine proposing. And we know how that went. Ehud Barak puts on the table a proposal designed to address everything that I grew up believing is what stands up between us and peace. A sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, bordering on Egypt and Jordan, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, ending Israel's military presence, the occupation. Essentially, check, check, check. All that Arafat had to do was say yes. What does he do? You all know, he walks away. And that even is not the most important thing. Not only does he walk away, not only does Abu Mazen, 8 years later, from another prime minister, we kept trying, we kept voting prime ministers to try. Abu Mazen, another Palestinian leader, walks away. Even the walking away is not the most important thing. They follow it up with murderous violence. I'm sure many of you know. In the years 2001, 2, 3, 4, misnamed the Second Intifada, but there was no popular uprising there. It was a campaign of butchery that before October 7th really was the darkest time to live in Israel. A palpable sense that if you were leaving your home, you are playing Russian roulette with your life. And I would say even that's not the most important, that they walk away, that they followed it up with violence. What is the most important aspect is that there were no dissenting voices. Not even a low-level Palestinian activist living in London saying, "Are you nuts? We're on the verge of getting everything we've ever wanted. Go back and get it for us." None. No such voices. And to the extent that anyone ever tells me, "Oh, Palestinians can't criticize their leaders," I'm like, "Oh, yes, they do." And they criticize their leaders a lot. Do you know for what? For daring to negotiate. But when they left the negotiation room, there were no such criticism. And sometimes people, no matter how much I bring up history, people try to say, "But now." I'm like, you know what? Now. Recently, Ehud Barak published the map that he proposed, because over the years there was this, the excuse, "Oh, there wasn't a map." So Barak finally decided to put an end to that, and he was like, "Yes, there was a map. This is the map." He put it online. He published it. Now, in 2025, there were no voices that said, "Oh my God, that was so good. How did we not say yes to that?" Now. So as I lived through that, I began to ask a very simple question. What do the Palestinians want? Because it's clearly not a sovereign state, and it's clearly not an end to the occupation, and it's clearly not an end to settlements, and it's clearly not a capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, because all these things were on the table again and again and again, and they walked away, followed it up with violence, to no dissenting voices. So I'm like, there's something else they must want that's more important to them than all these things. And I began to research. That became the book, The War of Return. I met Palestinians, ones that were called moderate. And I realized, to their credit, they have always told us what they wanted. We just didn't listen. Or when we listened, it sounded so preposterous that we thought, "Oh, this is just a negotiating tactic. This is just bluster. They're just saying that." No, they've said it, and to their credit, they said it, and they did it, and they were consistent. They always said, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." In case you're wondering, free of what? In Arabic it says, "From water to water, Palestine will be Arab." And as I do the research, I come across a quote. I've been using it ever since because it's wonderful. It's a quote from February 1947 by the British foreign minister at the time, Ernst Bevven. I'm sure you know he was no friend to the Jewish people. He goes to the British Parliament to explain why Britain failed to fulfill the terms of the mandate that it was unanimously given by the League of Nations to help the Jews achieve sovereignty. It did not fail all the other mandates. It created Iraq and Jordan and France, Syria and Lebanon, but it failed the Jews. So he needs to explain why, and this is why Britain is giving back the mandate to the heir of the League of Nations. If you've ever wondered why there was a vote at the UN General Assembly, it's because this is the one mandate of the League of Nations that was not fulfilled. So Britain failed the trust that it was given. He needs to explain why. They're a serious country. So he says the following: His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. This is February 47. He calls it irreconcilable. In February 47, I will remind you, there is no occupation, no settlements, no blockade of Gaza, no Bibi. There was such a time. There is even no one that has been displaced. So in the case anyone ever sells you the story that the conflict is because evil Zionism displaced the peace-loving Arabs that were living there, in February of 47, everyone is in place. And he already calls it irreconcilable. And he goes on to say, in the land there are two groups, Jews and Arabs. Of course, at this point, no one is called a Palestinian. And he said, each one of them has a top priority. He calls it the point of principle. He says, for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. Great. The Jews and Zionism are an actual liberation movement that seek sovereignty, independence, and the realization of the general principle of self-determination for the people of Israel in the land of Israel. Great. And then he goes on to say, and he says, the Arabs in the land, and those are the Arabs who will later hijack the name Palestine to be known as Palestinians. He says, for those Arabs, the top priority, the most important thing, is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. By definition, irreconcilable. I was recently debating with someone, and he said, Einat, you cannot make this into a zero-sum conflict. It's a word that Americans can't abide, zero-sum, oh no. And I was like, I'm sorry, but from their perspective, it's a zero-sum because what they say is that their top priority is to resist to the last, in case you ever encounter the word resistance, the establishment of Jewish sovereignty anywhere, in any size, of any borders in the land. Now, sometimes when I tell this story of kind of my personal journey and my understanding of the conflict, people tell me, oh, Einat, you've changed your opinions. You've moved from the left to the right. And anything that really matters from society to economics, I remain very much a staunch leftist. But I tell people, this is not an opinion. I have opinions, quite a few. That's not one of them. This is not an opinion. Think of it like a scientist. You had a hypothesis. We had the hypothesis that what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state, Palestinian control of territories in the West Bank and Gaza. Then comes the part that people somehow like to erase. The hypothesis was tested. And because we're good Jewish scientists, we tested it multiple times in different ways, right? That's what you do to test a hypothesis. Two Israeli prime ministers, Barak and Olmert, test the hypothesis through direct negotiations with two different Palestinian leaders. We saw how that ended. In the middle, a right-wing Israeli prime minister, Ariel Sharon, says, you know what, fine. They can't sign an agreement that lives next to the Jewish state. We'll just get out. And at that time, I'm already working with Shimon Peres, and he's in the government. And I remember the night also that Ariel Sharon decided to get out of the border with Egypt, of the Philadelphia corridor. And the feeling was, we are going to leave the Palestinians no excuses, none. What he and I and many others underestimated is their remarkable ability to come up with new excuses. But at least at the time, the view was we're going to leave them no excuses. We know what they did with Gaza. A beautiful strip of territory. You can really know that the people who work with Trump were once in real estate. Because when David Friedman, he doesn't work with him now, but when the American president presented the plan for Gaza, what David Friedman went online and he said, Gaza's beaches are sunset-facing beaches. And I was like, that's a real estate term. These are not just any beaches, these are sunset-facing beaches. So they take that territory, which really had all the potential to become the Dubai of the Levant, and they say no. True to our singular focus to destroy what the Jews have built, We are going to turn Gaza into a single, integrated, connected, weaponized landscape for the purpose of liberating Palestine from the river to the sea. So at one point, you have to appreciate their consistency. So when we talk about the two-state solution, you know, sometimes people tell me, but you know, Einat, there's a lot of Palestinian leaders who said that they accept the two-state solution. They said two-state solution, some still do. And I'm like, you know what? When we heard Palestinian leaders say two-state solution, and they said that, they said two states, we assumed that one of the two is the Jewish state. Crazy. In retrospect, we should have checked. Because when they said a two-state solution, what they were meaning is an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab state to replace Israel through this mechanism of what they call refugee return. The millions they claim are not refugees. There's no such thing as a right of return. You can read The War of Return to know that. But that's what they meant. That's what. There was actually never a moment in the last century when there was a Palestinian vision of peace where there was a Jewish state anywhere to be found. So when we say, is the two-state solution still possible, I'm like, there was never a single moment when there was on the Palestinian side a vision where there was a two-state solution where one of them is Jewish. And, you know, a lot of my criticism within Israel is that on this issue, we are absolutely criminally delinquent. Because on this issue, the Palestinians are our best allies because they do not lie. They will lie about everything else, open-air prison, famine, genocide. One lie is revealed, they'll replace it with another. On this, that their entire ideology and identity is tied up with the negation of the Jewish right to self-determination, they do not lie. Again, I've tested it multiple times. I once, a few years ago, long before October 7th, a delegation of American students came to Israel. I gave them the usual talk I give about the conflict and my personal journey. And at the end of my talk, one of the students, who's the head of Students for Justice in Palestine in her university, in parentheses, again, when Westerners hear justice, they think, okay, give them a state, that's just. When Palestinians say justice, as in Students for Justice for Palestine, a just solution to the refugee issue, there is only one justice, which is undoing the injustice, which is the very existence of the Jewish state. So she's the head of the Students for Justice in Palestine. I finished my talk and she said, you just said that Palestinians don't want peace, which is not what I said. I'm very precise in my words. I said that there has never been in the last century a Palestinian vision of peace where there's a Jewish state anywhere to be found. But she heard that I said that Palestinians don't want peace. So she said, that's not true. I'm a Palestinian and I want peace. Now, 99.99% of people would stop there and they'll be like, ha, Einat is wrong. Look, the head of the Students for Justice in Palestine wants peace. But I've developed a musical ear. So I ask her, what does peace look like? And what was fascinating is that she could not utter a vision of peace where there's a Jewish state anywhere to be found. Every time I said, is there a Jewish state? She said, but you're racist, you're colonialist, you're this, you're that. But she couldn't. She just couldn't. And I've tested it multiple times. And by the way, over the years, I'm aware this is the toughest thing I say. I've come to call this ideology Palestinianism. It's the ideology and identity that connects and unites the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank and in Jordan and in Syria and in Lebanon and their collaborators and supporters around the world. Palestinianism has four core tenets. From the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and we are therefore perpetual refugees until return. And to the extent that anyone thinks that return is some soft nostalgia to a home once lost, return is October 7th. The Palestinian vision of return was always synonymous with a triumphant victory over the Jewish state. You read Palestinian texts from the 50s and 60s, they describe return as we will tear their hearts out of their bodies, their fingernails from their limbs. And this is why you saw euphoria in Gaza and other places on October 7th. It wasn't the euphoria of people breaking out of prison. We saw it was a lie, they replaced it with others. It was the euphoria of people who were groomed and fueled and supported for decades in the vision that one day there will be no Jewish state, and on that day, they saw their vision realized through the GoPro cameras. That's why there was euphoria on that day. So, you know, sometimes when I give this talk, let's say I have 30 minutes, it takes me about 29 minutes to really go through the history and bring people to the point that this is the conflict. The Jews want a state, the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. I have to say in parentheses, over the years, I would post on my Twitter feed, for example, this is the conflict. The Jews want a state, the Arabs, Palestinians want the Jews not to have a state. Real simple. This is what the responses on my feed would look like. Jews in Israel and abroad would be like, no way not. Just get rid of the occupation, get rid of Bibi, do this, do that. That's what the conflict is about. The Arabs on my feed be like, of course, your colonialist, white, supremacist settlers get out. Now, what I love about this discussion is that the Arabs on my feed were not disproving my hypothesis. They were proving it. They were justifying it. They think that really there should not be a Jewish state because of a whole bunch of reasons. But they very much confirmed that this is what the conflict is about. None would say, oh, just end the settlements and that's it. That's our only beef with you. We tell ourselves stories, but they, to their credit, are very clear. In the book, I invented a word called Westplaning. Westplaning is when Western journalists and academics and diplomats explain away what Palestinians very clearly say. You know, they'll march and be like, we don't want two states, we want one, get out from the river to the sea. And Westerners will be like, they're angry. So I'm like, I have come to respect them and to give them the respect of taking them at their word. So let's say I have 30 minutes for a talk and it takes me 29 minutes to establish, I would say scientifically, that this is what the conflict is about. It then only takes me 1 minute to say how will it end. Because once you understand what it's about, it's very clear how it ends. The conflict ends, if we go back to the Bevven Hypothesis, if one side finally forgoes their top priority. Either the Jews forgo their desire for a state. Certainly that's what our enemies have been busy trying to get us to do for the last century. Violence, boycotts, wars, terrorism, condemnations. They're trying to get the Jews either to disappear in some violence cataclysm or through exhaustion to get the Jews to basically say, you know what? All this violence and terrorism and condemnations, not worth it, we're out of here. And if that happens, they'll tell the story of, you see, we just had to wait them out. Of course, that's not how I want the conflict to end. So the other option, the only option for the conflict to end with a Jewish state standing, is if the Arabs in general, but the Palestinians in particular, finally let go of a century's obsession with destroying what the Jews have built, and finally focus on building for themselves. So we are at an incredible moment where, especially after what happened on October 7th, we need to be determined that this ends here. You know, sometimes people treat the conflict as if it's like a cycle of violence, just a bunch of savages stuck in a violent cycle that they can't get out of. But the cycle of violence is actually incredibly logical, because the perennial pattern of the conflict for the last century is that every time that the Arabs, and especially the Palestinians, went to war of annihilation, and there have been no other kind, to a war of annihilation against the Jewish state, and they fail, every time they get a redo. Every time they're told, try again. So they are logical people, and they try again. It's not a bunch of savages. I was recently in Paris for a talk about how to get to peace. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Back to the Future, but you remember the moment that Marty understands that he's in the 50s or in the 60s, right? He kind of goes into the diner, he reads a paper, and he begins to understand that he's in a different time era. So this was in the French Parliament. I'm entering there, and the discussion is, go back to the negotiating table, two-state solution, you really need to talk to each other. And I'm like, wow, I'm in the 90s. It's still there. So at one point, the moderator looks at me and she says, how can the EU help? And I don't know what your experience is, and we'll do it among friends, but often when EU people ask this question, it's always with the tone of, how can we enlightened people who live in peace help you savages solve your problems? So I told her, you know, what would really be nice is if the EU actually remembered how it became the EU. And it wasn't because you sat around a negotiating table and talked to each other. The EU became the EU because some ruthless leaders understood that unlike World War I, that ended with an unclear armistice, World War II has to end with those who are defeated knowing that they were defeated, signing an unconditional surrender, and then occupied and even divided, and going through a process of re-education, and then you could be the EU. But it would be really nice if you remembered that. And I told her, that's what I want for my people, nothing else. The same thing you have here. I want the ideology of Palestinianism that has brought nothing but destruction to the region and to all people, that this ideology finally die so that Jews and Arabs can finally live. And that ideology of Palestinianism has to be replaced by the ideology that is the only ideology that will ever bring peace to the region, one that I've come to call Arab Zionism, which now sounds crazy, but if you heard Luwa, you know that one day it won't be. And Arab Zionism is merely the Arab and Islamic embrace that the Jews are not some white European settler colonialist crusaders, all synonyms for foreigners get out, but Abraham, a people who have a history, the people of Israel in the land of Israel. That's all it is. And I remember, again, I was in a conference a few years ago, another European city, again talking about how to get to peace. Again, I say my usual, the day that the Palestinians will end their century-long war against the Jewish state, everything that goes with that. So someone who was sitting to the left of me, both physically and ideologically, said, what, you want the Palestinians to be Zionists? And I was like, yes. And the audience chuckled. And I was like, excuse me, I want to make my case. For me to be invited to this conference as an Israeli centrist, a moderate, a supporter of two states, I had as the entry ticket to say that I support the Palestinian right to self-determination. That was considered the base demand. I was like, why is it suddenly considered such an insane ask that the Palestinians, that the Arabs acknowledge the Jewish right to self-determination in their historic homeland. I'm not greedy, not the superior, not the exclusive right, but why is it so crazy to expect them to acknowledge this right? So, to end, all I'm saying is the issue of the two-state solution, the Jews have always agreed to a two-state solution for the last century, if one of the two is the Jewish state, and the Arabs have always rejected the two-state solution if one of the two is the Jewish state. So first, we need to address this. We need to address the ideology of Palestinianism. That ideology has to die. Once it dies, once the Arabs of Gaza, the West Bank, become a people who want to build rather than to destroy, we can discuss anything. A state, 7 emirates, they want to live somewhere else. Everything becomes possible once that ideology that has really just brought nothing but suffering and destruction finally dies, so that, as I said, Jews and Arabs can finally live. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Einat. We have a couple of questions from the people here. So, you were talking about the two-state solution as a solution of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state and another Arab Palestinian state. So, needed is a different leadership and a different paradigm. Another, stop the ideology and go more pragmatism for the Palestinians. How do you reach that at that point?
Okay. So the Palestinians will never, ever have the leaders that will break with that ideology as long as this is the ideology of the people. I am now working on a short book in Hebrew that will have the lovely title of Peace Not Now. And the idea is that I do sincerely believe that it is incumbent on every Israeli leader to always have a vision of peace. But we also need to have the long view and the patience to understand what it needs to get there. And for decades, we tried shortcuts, direct negotiations, disengagement, change the leadership, bring another leader. But if a people, and that is a tragedy, if a people have coalesced around an ideology of negation and destruction, they will only ever have leaders who reflect that. And even Abu Mazen, supposedly the moderate, has not been able to break away with the Palestinian vision of no Jewish state, perpetual refugeehood, and return. So what needs to happen is that the people need to change. And this is why this moment is so important. There is destruction and ruin in Gaza. I'm not denying that. The question is what you do with destruction and ruin. Destruction and ruin in personal as in collective lives can become moments of great growth and transformation, but not if you blame everybody else. Only if you finally acknowledge responsibility for the behaviors, the attitudes, the ideology that has led to the ruin. As I said, the reason we're stuck in conflict is that every time that the Palestinians fail to bring the Jewish state to its knees, rather than getting the message of, this is what you did, you need to become a different people with a different ideology, every time there is someone who is happy to indulge them and save them and say, no, no, you didn't lose, your victory is merely delayed. That is why I'm so focused on UNRWA. UNRWA sits at the original sin of telling the Arabs, rather than telling them after 1948 what all refugees in the world heard. It's tough, it's tragic, move on. They heard, no, keep trying, which they did. So we need to not waste this moment of ruin. And my big concern is that we have too many forces and pressures that want to waste it. There needs to be an understanding that nothing gets built in Gaza. No dollar, no yen, no euro, no pound goes in until it is clear that the people are truly willing to forge a path of building rather than destroying. They must be erased from UNRWA's records as Palestine refugees. No one in Gaza is a Palestine refugee. They must acknowledge publicly that there's no such thing as a right of return into Israel. Those are the two litmus tests that always help you know if they're serious. That has to be the process. And it's also good economics. The Gulf countries, they want to invest. No one will want to invest if it's going to be blown up in the next war. So how about ensuring that there will not be another war by ensuring that the people finally want to build something rather than destroy? And you know, whatever people think about the American president's plan for Gaza, it had at least some merits because, you know, as soon as he announced it, so many Arabs and especially Palestinians said, oh, you cannot displace the Gazans. Gaza is their home. And I was like, oh, that's news. Because for the last 75 years, you've been busy telling us that Gaza is not your home, that you are a fifth-generation Palestine refugee. So all I'm saying is that this is a really important moment to not waste this destruction, not to immediately go back to like ceasefire and giving billions and doing a redo. This is the moment where we need to break the pattern that has plagued the conflict for the last century.
So to bury the ideology, it's necessary for Israel to invade now Gaza, like they do in the north?
I'm separating the specific military kind of operation because a lot of diplomatic things can achieve the same as well. Israel insisting that it does not, again, the idea that a country has to supply its enemy at a time of war while it holds its hostages and refuses to surrender is bizarre. But one idea I have is if the Palestinians are now willing to surrender collectively the ideology of Palestinianism, create an area in Gaza where people can individually surrender. And that will be the only place where Israel will occupy and provide services. This is the place that only people who have been erased from UNRWA's records as Palestine refugees can enter, where they announce publicly, because especially for Palestinians, but in the Arab world in general, only things that are said publicly are of value. They need to publicly disavow the idea that they are refugees, that there is return. And as I said, they do not lie on this. And over the years, when people challenged me, they said, Einat, you're generalizing, you're exaggerating, it's a broad brushstroke. You know, you're from the river to the sea people. They have their from the river to the sea people, extremists on both sides. I was like, no, I'm not giving you something so easy. I was like, this is not symmetrical because at the end of the day, we are a tiny minority here, and they belong to the overwhelming dominant group, which is why they don't understand why they need to compromise with this crazy tiny minority. So they need to go through this process, and I tell them there's no exceptions. You think I'm exaggerating? You think I'm generalizing? I'm making it so easy for you to disprove me. Go find me a Palestinian who publicly, in their own voice, will say, I want to live next to the Jewish state, not from the river to the sea. I understand the implications are that we're not fifth-generation refugees. I do not possess the right of return into Israel. And I tell them, go. You think I'm exaggerating? Prove me wrong. It's so easy. They either don't come back, or they come back with the same 4 people that I already know. And those 4 people are important, and I platform them. But sometimes people tell me when I say, okay, create an area in Gaza where you will finally flip the equation. Rather than constantly funding Palestinianism, destroy the Jewish state, how about we fund the flip ideology? So sometimes people tell me, but Einat, you said there's only 4 such people. I said, fine, give them billions. I don't care. Let them all build castles. But at least you will start to flip the equation that for a century told Palestinians, try again, don't pay any consequences for your moronic choices, to an ideology that says we are only going to fund and support people who have a constructive ideology because it just makes sense.
Okay. So for a moment, let's talk about the Zionism as an ideology for settlers in the West Bank, a biblical piece of ideology, perhaps. The people say, well, how is getting land from in the West Bank from Arabs, expanding the settlers, how is that not an obstacle for peaceful cooperation?
Again, easy, amazing, and I am no supporter of the settlements. As far as I'm concerned, again, believe it's one of Israel's perhaps most wasteful projects, but it doesn't matter. Because like you see, the way that with Rabin, things like are empirically easy to disprove. So, why are settlements not the obstacle to peace? First, because the Arabs, remember Bevven, this is why I used the quote, the Arabs rejected the existence of a Jewish state long before there were settlements. Second, 2 Israeli prime ministers, Barak and Olmert, offered Palestinians a state without settlements, and they walked away and followed it up with violence. And there were no dissenting voices who said, if they just did this. So again, empirical proof number 2.
But sorry, it could be that that's a way of leadership. Leaderships are not acknowledging what the Palestinian people on the West Bank see and experience with the settlers.
It's a story that we tell ourselves. It's a comforting story. Believe me, I know why it's comforting, because what I said is not comforting. If people tell you, just get rid of the settlements, just get out of the West Bank, just get out of Gaza, just get rid of Bibi, those are actual, clear things to do, which we tried multiple times. So it's a comforting story that this is the reason. But one of the ways in which the conflict is mistold is the reversal of cause and effect. Sometimes, as I said, people say the conflict is because the Arabs were displaced. I'm like, no. Reversal of cause and effect. They were displaced because they went to a stupid war because it was more important to them, they said, that the Jews have nothing than that they have something. Recently, I was in another conference. I keep on telling you all my passport. It was in India. And before me spoke for 20 minutes a Palestinian woman. And she was like, oh, and the checkpoints, and we're suffering, and the checkpoints. I have a colleague who wrote a beautiful piece called Ecstasy and Amnesia. His name is Dr. Shimon, and he talks about how when the Arabs, and especially the Palestinians, go to wars of annihilation against the Jewish state, there's this annihilationist ecstasy. We saw it on October 7th. And as soon as they start losing, amnesia sets in. And they become blameless victims of great powers. And this is, again, why I said we need this moment to finally establish cause and effect, action, ideology, and consequences. So I came up after her and I said, checkpoints in the West Bank. Why are there checkpoints? Because literally minutes after you could have had a state, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, you went to a brutal campaign of butchery, which we felt powerless. Today, we don't remember it. I remember at the time, a bit like we feel sometimes now, we thought, how can we fight people who are willing to blow themselves up? How? They've got us beat. And ultimately, checkpoints were part of the way that we managed to put it at bay. Again, cause and effect. So the settlements are not the cause. Again, I think they're wasteful. I think they're unnecessary. I think the fact that there's no clear sovereignty creates a lot of problems. But they're not the cause of the conflict. And it's really easy to empirically show, because every single time that the Palestinians could have had a state without settlements, and again, Israel has shown its ability to destroy settlements. Every time that the Palestinians were given a choice, and people are revealed in their choices, not in like what they say when they don't face choices. Every time they had a choice, they made it clear that it's not the settlements, that it's more important for them that the Jews have nothing. So as far as I'm concerned, the settlements could disappear tomorrow. As I said, I supported disengagement. That's not the reason the Palestinians are at war with us.
So what is the solution for the West Bank? What should be done in the most positive way?
So again, we need to separate between how Israel manages the interim until Palestinianism as an ideology dies, and the notion of solution. Solution is only one. There's only one solution, which is Palestinianism as an ideology goes at the door. And then you can discuss political solutions. One of the problems we've had for so long is that we've discussed, so the borders here and the state here, and maybe not one state, 3 states, maybe 7 emirates. Everyone would look at like solutions before dealing with the fundamental problem, which is the other side is not interested in any arrangement, in any political arrangement that legitimizes the existence of a Jewish state in any borders. If we don't handle that, then what's the use discussing everything else? Once you understand that settlements are not the reason we don't have peace, it becomes an internal Israeli issue. Here, I think the internal Israeli issue that I think we suffer from is that there's no clear sovereignty, and I think it clears a lot of problems. So I think Israel should annex some of the areas, of course, where most Jews live, make it clear that this is sovereign Israeli territory, even if nobody recognizes that. That's actually important. When Israel annexes territory, people there behave more like citizens of a state. When you create areas of unclear sovereignty, it also creates more problems and violence. Annex some of the areas, and the other areas engage in what I call active occupation, apropos America and Germany or America and Japan, one that seeks, not like what we did for the last 50, almost 60 years, we've always tried to do what I call occupation on the cheap. You know, that's why we wanted UNRWA, that's why I led NGOs, that everyone, and as a result, the ideology kept getting fueled. So if we're going to control an area, we need to control it in a way that begins the process of killing the ideology, so the occupation ends with a political arrangement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very clear. Thank you. Very good. Very good.